Welcome to the seminar. My name is Narelle Meragliotta and I'm here with my colleague Matt Lang and my other colleague Paul Thornton-Smith, and we've been working on a project to do with convenience voting in Victoria, and today what we're going to do is present some of our findings from that study. So Matt's going to talk you through some of the data we have and some of the tentative findings and conclusions we're beginning to draw. And what we're really hoping for is an opportunity for feedback from the audience, for people to give us some of their ideas and thoughts about the project that they may have, because there's clearly quite a number of people that know potentially more than we do about the topic. So we're very happy to hear from them. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Matt. We were thinking about maybe talking for about 40 minutes. Yes, that seems reasonable, and then opening it up for 20 minutes for a discussion from the audience. I shall step aside and leave you to my colleague Matthew.
Awesome, thanks Narelle. Yes, as she said, my name is Matt Lang, and along with Narelle and Paul, we've been looking at convenience voting in Victoria, which I've amusingly titled An Inconvenient Truth, because like CO2 emissions, convenience voting has predicted to reach a sort of a critical point at the next election. This is from the VIC's own numbers, and as you can see, they're expecting ordinary votes, that is non-early votes, not absent, postal or early votes, to fall to just over 50% at the upcoming election this year. So it seems like an apropos time to sort of look at the issue of convenience voting, which has crept up fairly steadily and fairly rapidly from fairly modest beginnings over a long period of time, to a point where they're almost rendering the very concept of election day in Australia a little bit old-fashioned. And that has all sorts of implications attached to it. So we wanted to take a bit of a helicopter view in our project of the convenience voting issue. And we were very much interested in looking at all the different components of convenience voting as they fit together, the model of why so many people have switched to convenience voting, and you know, why the numbers are continuing to grow, and why they're probably likely to continue to grow, you know, continue to grow beyond even whatever thresholds we previously thought were the maximum. So we wanted to look at the rise and the regulatory and legal perspectives behind that, and some of the administrative and social changes that have allowed it. We also wanted to really look at the perspectives of the different stakeholders for Victorian elections, and what their perspectives were on both the rise of convenience voting and some of the challenges it presents in the future. So we wanted to talk to politicians, we wanted to talk to party organisations, we wanted to talk to the Electoral Commission, and we wanted to talk to voters and see how they felt about this issue. And our long-term goal, of course, is also to look at some of the challenges, not that we're just facing right now, but also what's just over the horizon for convenience voting. What are we going to have to be looking at, assuming that the numbers continue to rise, because the issue can't really be ignored, and there are all sorts of issues connected with the concept of an election day. The 1992 Act that regulates election broadcast, for example, has a media blackout period the Wednesday before election day. How relevant is a law like that in a context where more than 50% of the population are voting before election day? So we think there's a lot of things like that which are baked in to our current election regulations, which may not make sense in a very short period of time. So our scope was really looking at convenience voting in all forms, but of course most of what we're talking about in early voting is early in-person voting or pre-polling, or postal voting. And although online and some of the other kind of more exotic forms of convenience voting are within our ambit, we didn't really focus on those. They're part of the future technological landscape of voting, which there's a lot of interest around and no doubt will come later. But really we were very much mostly interested in the rise in postal and early pre-poll in-person voting. So we've kind of focused on that. And we used a variety of different methods to try and get at the different groups we wanted to talk to about that. Obviously, we reviewed a lot of the literature around convenience voting and did a lot of looking at the legislative and regulatory evolution that's enabled convenience voting to rise so quickly in Victoria. We tried to get at politicians a couple of different ways, but our best shot at it was a massive survey monkey survey we sent out to all of the legislators in Australia, and we got 51 valid responses from people sitting in Parliament. So we got a reasonably okay sample size on an 18-question survey about how they felt about issues relating to the rise of early and convenience voting. We conducted interviews, a roundtable interview with the VIC leadership. on the issue of convenience voting, and we attempted as best we could individual interviews with party organisations. Many of them were not particularly keen to talk to us, so we also kind of backwardly deduced some of their positions from things like submissions to the Electoral Matters Committee and whatnot to get a sense of where the party organisations' thinking were on these issues, since they generally comment on them to that committee every 4 years or so. So we've tried our best to sort of deduce party organisations from that way. And then we conducted focus groups that were done by the Social Research Centre here in Melbourne with people who had voted, well, 2 groups that had voted using convenience voting before, a group that had never convenience voted before, and a group that was mixed. And those were quite productive and very interesting sessions, which were able to draw out some of the reasons why these people were becoming convenience voters, why they stayed that way, and how they felt about the issues that the other groups had identified. And we wanted to find out how voters felt about some of the issues related to convenience voting. So in this presentation, I'm just going to glide over as much of this stuff as possible, rather than trying to accurately or quickly summarize our massive report that we're still generating on all this stuff. I thought we'd take a bird's eye view of just the different groups and what they said and what we found were most interesting emerging out of it. Certainly the electoral commissions had the perspective which you would expect them to have. Their job, obviously, their role is to maximise elector participation, whilst ensuring that it's efficient and cost effective, that the integrity of the elections are maintained, and that security is paramount to all of that. And so obviously, or wouldn't be surprised to expect that a lot of the issues arising out of Electoral Commission's thoughts on this were to do with managing the rise of early and convenience voting, anticipating demand, an issue that came up. We also sent a survey out to other electoral commissions to try and verify some of the perspectives we got in Victoria, and they're roughly similar. I just pulled out some block quotes here from electoral commissioners or from our interviews with the VIC. Maintaining security, obviously an important issue, especially in the context of online voting perhaps being just over the horizon in Victoria. The complexity of the count was an issue which, of course, is something they have to consider, especially when you have early voting centres with potentially 88 different piles of ballots in them, which have to go back to be counted in their home electorate. So we know that that's becoming an increasing issue and a logistical challenge for the count. Sourcing venues, which of course is an issue which obviously wouldn't occur to other groups or stakeholders, but how do they secure enough venues that will take on something as unattractive as a 3-week lease in a commercial centre to be given over as a polling place. But the commissions were fairly cognizant of the fact that voter expectations have risen about voting. Voters, like they expect from their banks or any other form of secure service, they expect voting to be able to move that direction. Certainly our focus groups kind of back that up. Voters couldn't exactly understand why voting hadn't moved online yet, and certainly the commissions are aware of that, so they know they're under this pressure as client or service user orientated organisations to deliver on that, and so those are just these are the administrative issues that need to be dealt with. Looking at parties and politicians, which I've lumped together for the purpose of this presentation, but in reality we found that the party organisations and politicians weren't exactly aligned on some of these issues. The biggest difference being that party organisations, that is the party functionaries who actually are organising logistics of campaigns, are well aware of the realities of early convenience and other postal voting. They're prepared for it, or they are preparing for it, and their major concerns and interests, of course, are being able to maintain access to voters, being able to make information available to them, and being able to campaign effectively in this new environment. Politicians, we found an enormous variety of responses on this issue. There was certainly no particular partisan bias in favour of one thing or the other. The Greens tend to be more supportive of things like online voting. But the issues that they raised were really diverse. The surveys that we conducted, we let a lot of scope for individual politicians to write comments, which were very interesting about what they felt about convenience voting. Probably at the surface level, there's a major distinction between the sort of in-principle objections to convenience voting. So things like security, reliability, fraud, and privacy of the ballot were frequent topics that they would raise. But when you dug down into it, a lot of it is also about maintaining their ability to campaign effectively in that environment. So there's sort of pragmatic and principled concerns that sometimes they married, but sometimes were sort of very obviously in different boxes and advanced by different interest groups. Some of the major issues that consistently came up in party submissions to the Electoral Matters Committee and also in some of our interviews were things like voters voted regret. Small parties particularly were worried that the rise of early voting meant a lot of people would be voting for parties that they might regret having voted for, this particular point down the track. Access to voters, particularly for small parties, was important. Small parties felt that the longer campaign periods sort of benefited them and gave them more time to make their arguments and get media attention, et cetera, through the course. And they felt that early voting was cutting off or reducing their ability to reach all voters potentially. And certainly the resources required to campaign effectively in an environment of early voting, that is having how to vote workers at early voting centres, or having campaign assistants who can manage to run much of their campaign as possible before the early voting period begins. A lot of small parties felt it was impossible for them to keep up with the demands created by that, and that the growth of early voting was disadvantaging them and getting their voice out. And certainly the larger parties had concerns about too. The ALP raised issues about how they're going to raise sufficient numbers of volunteers, et cetera, to be able to service all the pre-poll stations that are emerging and be able to capture all those voters that are voting early. So a lot of issues to do, with campaigning methods. One of the survey questions we asked was support for forms of convenience voting, which we asked them to rate from 0 to 10, 0 being completely opposed and 10 being completely support. We were surprised that support for early voting, as it currently stands, although there is a large chunk of people who completely support it, it was not as strong as we were kind of expecting. A lot of people, politicians, are on the fence about it or have concerns about its rapid expansion. And there are a small cadre group that have become more and more against it over time as they've seen the numbers increase. Postal voting was evidently the least controversial and most acknowledged it had to exist, and it was comments like the original and the best were pretty common. So postal voting, and of course a very large chunk of legislators who are completely and utterly opposed to online or internet voting of any support. A small but important cadre of tended to be Greens legislators or progressive legislators who were in support of it though. Getting some of the comments though from individual legislators that they were able to leave in the survey were particularly interesting, and I picked out the ones that sort of amused me the most from individual members. Certainly there was a sense, and I think this kind of came out a lot in individual comments, about the sanctity of election day, and a lot of politicians were worried that something vital about Australian democracy was being eroded with the erosion of election day. A lot of people this comment I love, polling is supposed to be done a single day, not over a period of time. It's not like we are a third world country. I'm not sure what exactly that's supposed to be referring to, but there are a lot of comments sort of in that category of, the efficiency of our election process should be such that it's all counted and done on election day, that people, avoiding election campaign workers and having sausage sizzles is an important and integral part of democracy in Australia. So there was a lot of kind of nostalgia around that. There was a lot of concern that voting was becoming increasingly ephemeral in Australia and wasn't being taken seriously by voters. It is to politics what pornography is to sex, according to one South Australian Labor politician, I thought was very quotable. And there was a kind of concern that, yes, the campaign period was falling apart. They're not getting the full information, especially as a lot of parties didn't release their full policies or their full information to voters in time to capture all of the early voters sometimes. So a variety of different issues being raised by different legislators, and it was very large. Our survey actually didn't really even have enough categories for all the issues that were being raised. And one of the last questions we asked in the survey, which I thought was very interesting, was what kind of statement accurately reflects your view of the future of election day in Australia? And there was still a significant proportion who thought that elections still should be conducted on a single day with as many voters as possible, that there'd been that basically early voting was out of control, it had to be pared back, that election day had to be maintained. There were about another third who were ambivalent or unsure about whether it was a good thing or not. And then about a third who were very enthusiastic about it and felt that election day was an old-fashioned idea and it would go the way of the dodo. So quite a diversity of views, and there wasn't a clear partisan split necessarily between how different legislators felt on these issues. Then we went to voters. We had focus groups here in Melbourne with different voters, depending on whether they'd had been convenience voters or not, to ask them to try and kind of dig into the issues about how they started voting, why they stayed voting convenience, and how they felt about some of these issues, particularly the ones that were raised by the commissions, parties and politicians. And I think what really surprised us is how little unease there was about convenience voting across the board. People who hadn't used it or people who had used it, a lot of people were not terribly concerned about any of the concerns that we could be able to raise. We raised security, we raised reliability, we raised issue by privacy, and voters were remarkably unfussed by a lot of these. They acknowledged that they were issues and there were issues to be sorted out. But overall, they trusted the system. They thought whatever was happening was generally fine, and that their major interests were making it convenient, as accessible as possible, ease of use, and that includes things like having a ballot paper that's easy to fill out, and a lot of them supported online voting simply for the fact that it would stop them from filling out their ballot incorrectly, potentially. So issues like that, which haven't appeared in any other stakeholder groups' interviews, they certainly raised. And a lot of, we just want to avoid penalties for misuse, which I guess is a kind of a function of the compulsory voting issues in this country. In terms of push factors or why people identified, why they started convenience voting or why they found it attractive, there was certainly a group of people who felt, well, because we're forced to do it, there should be more options. We shouldn't be, made to do something difficult or hard. We agree that, compulsory is a good thing, but if it's going to be compulsory, it has to be easy. Certainly, queues at polling stations, wait times, being hassled by election workers, that came up. Just about everyone mentioned that. No one liked the experience of going election day, despite politicians, in their comments waxing lyrical about the magic of election day. A lot of the voters didn't feel that magic and felt that it was a really unpleasant environment in which to vote. Issues about time, being rushed in polling booths. A lot of people, especially as the ballot papers expand in size, not having sufficient time at the polling booth to fill it out correctly. People wanted to go and maybe use their phones to research what are these parties I've never heard of that I can see on the paper and being asked to vote on. And of course the Saturday issue, which is a long-standing one. And we found that if we looked at why people started convenience voting, there are pretty much two pathways. There was an important cadre of people who had a deliberate reason, and this is probably the pathway that was intended when the Electoral Commissions and legislators changed laws to improve accessibility to those options. They had a specific reason, one election. It was either illness, or they were away from town, or on vacation, or something like that. And they sought out an option for alternative voting. They went on the website or something like that. But there was an awful large group that were opportunistic. They'd just seen that there was an early voting centre, perhaps near where they worked or where they were going, and they popped in and voted. Or they'd heard from someone that it was really easy just to go next door and vote. And that represented quite a large group of people who had become convenience voters. And the important thing overall for those two groups is once they started convenience voting, they really didn't go back. They'd found it was better, it was cleaner, there weren't people bothering them, they got in and out in 10 minutes or 5 minutes. For them the system was so far superior to the experience of election day that very few went back to voting and casting ordinary votes, even if they had no reason to the next year. And a lot of people freely admitted in the focus groups they were technically breaking the law, but they just didn't go back. They didn't see any reason to go back, it didn't seem to be a big hassle to do it. A lot of postal voters were exactly the same. They'd applied for a postal vote one year. It was so efficient and easy, they just kept doing it, and some of them just became general postal voters. And we asked them, we probed them on the various issues that we'd identified in other contexts. We asked them about security and reliability. This was a big issue when we did the focus groups. This was not too far in the aftermath from the 2016 US election, and it was about mid-2017 where a lot of the first details about Russian influence had come out. And certainly, the example of James Comey in the last minute, issue come out. So there was a lot of, fresh examples of the problems in people's minds. But really, people were not terribly fussed about security. They acknowledged it was an issue and something that had to be sorted out. But people either felt that it couldn't be done at such a scale that it would dramatically change the outcome of the election, or they felt that, I just assumed that if online voting was available, they would have those safeguards in place already. So they had a lot of high trust in the system to iron out those issues before it ever reached them. And I think that was heartening, although perhaps interesting that they're that blindly faithful about the security of our election systems. But certainly there wasn't a lot of concern that there would be an issue with it. Same with voter regret. I was surprised how few people thought this was an issue, even though some people did have examples of having voted for someone and maybe had second thoughts about them. There wasn't a lot of worry about that either. Well, it doesn't make a big difference because I'm just one vote, even if I regret it. Too bad, I've already done it, kind of thing. This was, I thought, a terribly pragmatic comment from one participant. I think the people who are releasing the skeletons will release it 9 days earlier as opposed to 2 days earlier, which is possibly true. And people offset the kind of possibility for voter regret information by the idea that, well, if you did a poster vote or something like that, you actually get more time to educate yourself on the candidates, the policies, and engage with the process. So a lot of them felt that actually when they went into the voting booth on voting day, they didn't really know perhaps enough to make a really informed vote. They knew the major parties or something like that, and that's kind of how it all ended up. If it's done in a postal environment or earlier, they might actually have some chance to get real information about candidates and parties. So there was not a lot of support for voter regret or lack of information. Ease and privacy was definitely a major strength, according to voters, that they felt that, especially in concerns, think, well, what about, voter intimidation at home or being, pressured when you're doing a poster vote or something like that. People kind of generally felt either there would be more voter intimidation in the postal booth for one reason or another, because people are constantly pushing materials into your hand. So they didn't really get the idea that there wasn't pressure at the voting booth and it was a sort of a sacred, safe space for them to vote in. Things like time pressure in the voting booth led to unease about using it, that they had to be rushed, that they might not fill out their ballot paper correctly because they're so quickly trying to fill it out. They don't want to hold people up. They don't want to seem like they're stupid and they don't know how to vote. So there wasn't kind of a lot of support for the idea that ease, or they felt that ease was certainly better at home. As I mentioned before, the idea that online systems could catch them from doing the wrong, casting an irregular ballot or informal ballot. Even the idea that, well, I forget sometimes to go vote on Saturday, so if it's, there's a bigger time frame in which to do it, there's less chance that happening. And certainly the idea of election day, being this sort of sacred institution of Australia, the idea was, well, I think now with Facebook and the rest of social media, that's how you catch up, I guess, rather than a polling booth. People were not very attached to it at all. There was some sort of nice comments about the sausage sizzles and things like that. But most of them were kind of very pragmatic about, the point is we need to move to more convenience and accessibility. Emphasize once again, we know that once they've done it once, they tend to do it again. And that was, kind of the key part of, I think, modelling the phenomenon, is that all it really requires is a person to discover about convenience voting or do it once, and then they're sort of converted. We even had one person in a focus group, a mixed focus group, where there was some who had and some who hadn't, who heard from the other people in the focus group about the existence of early voting and said that he would do it at the next election because he didn't realise that he had that option. So we even may have created one convenience voter ourselves unwittingly, sorry Paul, through this process. We know that the voting public, or the voters that we interviewed and did focus groups with, are certainly way ahead of these issues and certainly driving or pushing it. So given what we found out from the different stakeholders and groups, we then became interested in looking at, well, how do we kind of match this up with making a model of convenience voting's evolution in Victoria and looking at the kind of timeline of regulatory and legal changes and how this might fit up with what we've learnt. And certainly, a sort of pattern seems to emerge when you combine what we know the drivers are from the voters' end and what's been happening legislative and regulatorily. Often what happens, or at least happened in Victoria, but it seems to be the case in other ways, the original expansions of convenience voting have generally been incremental. There hasn't obviously been a big, act of parliament or an act of change where they've decided that we're going to switch to early voting. A lot of the changes that have actually enabled the rise of early voting in Victoria have been made, fairly innocuously to service very specific groups that might have been disadvantaged at the last election. But these alternative methods have been hard to prevent other people from using, even if it wasn't designed originally for them to use. And so the eligibility kind of issue tends to expand over time, especially as other groups are identified as needing it. If it's the elderly who should have access to it, why not people who are ill, or why not people who are in prison, et cetera. And so eligibility tends to expand. And progressively, voters seem to have drifted into these methods, and a whole lot of people who it wasn't designed for drift into these methods. But once at that point, the eligibility test becomes problematic. It's very difficult once it's reached a certain threshold then to stop 20% of voters who are trying to come to the polling booth to vote early to actually state their reason and prove that they're not eligible for it. And so you kind of have this act of futility once it reaches a certain threshold. And then political parties who, and political politicians who may dislike the changing nature of the elections due to convenience voting, they don't really have a lot of basis or a lot of policy options to argue against increased voter participation, and so it kind of becomes a fait accompli. And so certainly we've kind of seen this sort of virtuous circle start to emerge. A good example of that is regulatory creep. I would describe it in early in-person voting. In Victoria, a lot of the early regulatory or legal changes that allowed it weren't necessarily designed to create what eventually happened. If you think about, what are the first things that was relevant to the creation of the early voting phenomenon in Victoria, it was simply the initial intent to create an early voting centre at Melbourne Airport, which they gave the Commissioner special powers to do in 1991 to declare specific areas as polling centres that weren't regular VEC locations. The intention was just for Melbourne Airport, and eventually in 1992 just for a couple of specific holiday locations to capture small groups of voters who might not necessarily be being serviced very well by the current system. But the intention wasn't really to go a long way before that, but of course in doing that they'd created a special category of polling station, the early polling station, which is now the fundamental basis of it, by which the Commissioner announces early voting centres. But that wasn't, of course, the original intention. You get a slow creep, though, over the 1996 and 1999 elections, where voting centres are moving into more commercial areas or more central areas. VEC offices, initially you had to go do an oral postal vote at the returning officer's location. Those office locations changed between elections and a lot of them became progressively more central to the electorate or in more high foot traffic areas. They started to create extra voting centres in places like shopping centres or universities or close to that. In 2002 there were 26 additional voting centres created, almost triple that of the previous one. Some of those are to serve as regional centres where they might need extra polling stations in remote areas, but there are also a lot more that opened up in Melbourne City in more central locations, particularly two in the Melbourne Central Business District, which of course increases the visibility of voting stations, and more people realise they exist, will go in and use them. And so that sort of starts to create a sort of a cycle where demand starts to go up, and every year the election reports note that the capacity is being reached. They need more early voting centres in order to reach user demand. So it sort of starts to feed into itself, and then until you reach the most recent about 45 new early voting centres in 2006 and 2010. And even the language around the justification has shifted towards convenience and accessibility in the reports that justify this regulatory change. It's changed initially from just capturing that small group of voters who might be going on holiday at Melbourne Airport and forget to vote. It's now a very large group of people that it's starting to capture. It's not entirely due to the existence of early voting centres. Obviously, we know in 2014, for the first time since 1991, the VEC did not increase the number of early voting centres from the previous election, but early voting rises regardless. And so we know there's also a point where word of mouth and people's interactions or advertising starts to play a role in encouraging people to use these forms. And certainly it seems like the group of people who are already convenience voting don't go back to ordinary voting. So it's just sort of accreting over time. And what you get is kind of this fait accompli. Of course, it gets to a certain point where you can no longer kind of reverse course. This comment from Colin Barnett in response to the changes that were made just before the 2017 Western Australian election, I think are kind of indicative of that. They changed essentially the eligibility requirements, convenience voting, to pretty much the bare minimum. They just had to they didn't have to declare reason to convenience vote anymore. And the quote there, at the last state election, over 150,000 voters elected early. This was an increase of over 37% on the previous general election. This figure is expected to rise considerably for the 27 election. Currently, to vote early, an elector must declare a reason to set out in the Act. The operational reality is that polling officials cannot test the veracity of such claims. So there's no high-minded, principled kind of argument for the change there. It's simply that, well, the numbers have become too high, and this is just the way it's going. It's sort of unstoppable now. So I kind of put together this highly convoluted virtuous circle model, which kind of indicates, that there is a sort of a consistent process with regulatory expansion coupled with public enthusiasm for new voting methods that essentially create a bit of a process which is very hard to throw into reverse. Certainly, everything we've seen is generally the original, reason behind expanding accessibility or lowering eligibility for convenience voting has always been uncontroversial. It's happened fully under the views of parliaments. It hasn't happened, kind of deviously, and it all seems logical enough, of course, when it's argued out in parliaments and looking at Hansard and whatnot. It's barely mentioned most of the changes that would eventually lead to a lot of the functions that would allow the rise in convenience voting. They're not controversial when they're proposed, but the new method is always seemingly more popular or used much more by voters than is intended. And the Commission, of course, must continue to expand service availability to meet demand. That tends to lead to expansion to other groups because, of course, you can't justify excluding certain groups who have similar situations to others. At some point, that becomes from what we know about the model of convenience vote, that becomes a self-sustaining process. Service expansion will lead to more uptake, and politically, then it becomes sort of difficult. The toothpaste is out of the tube by that point. So a lot of that leads us to conclude that, that is the inconvenient truth of convenience voting. It really won't go into reverse. We couldn't see a lot of options that would make voters less attracted to it or for them to turn away from it. They're further ahead of where the commissions and political parties and politicians are, and they're enthusiastically embracing the methods, even amongst a focus group that included, very old voters and very young voters. There wasn't a huge demographic difference in their reception to it. Maybe there were some older voters who were somewhat nostalgic about election day, but we didn't really see enough of a difference between the groups to suggest that there might be a natural limit or a natural demographic that's going to, use convenience voting and some that are just going to stay away from it. It seemed like it was going to be most of the population attracted to it, and over time, it's sort of just a matter of time. And for the most part, they're not concerned about the same issues, so they're enthusiastic and they're going to proceed with it. Obviously, that's creating administrative problems for the commissions. It creates problems for the parties. The parties obviously have been handmaidens to these changes, but not really recognising or predicting the impacts that they would have. Now, of course, there's a bit of their own voter regret as they deal with the challenges going forward, and they are, of course, the biggest, probably the group most impacted by this, politicians and parties. Particularly small parties or small rural MPs who might not get a lot of support from the national parties. They need to find a way to deal with this. But evidently they're going to have to deal with it. I think the question is now, are we at a certain threshold or a certain point where we need to not start accepting the new reality as a given, and therefore do we look into the other legislation that's tied into the concept of things like election day, which inevitably are kind of being eroded by this process. So I think I'll leave it there.
Well done. Yes, you did that.
Did I do it in 40 minutes?
Did less than 40 minutes.
Yay!
Yeah.